Welcome to Baptist Bridges, a podcast by the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec. We will explore a variety of topics that we trust will be meaningful to people and churches around the world. We're glad you're here.
So, welcome everyone to Baptist Bridges and a very special episode. We are recording at Brock University as we have just finished our first round of Pastor's Day for our assembly. For assembly this year, we were so delighted to have Dr. Sam Reimer come as our guest, and he graciously agreed to give us a window of his time to also be a guest on our podcast, so that our many congregants, board members, pastors who may not have been able to make it to assembly could glean from some of these teachings. And I suspect that the people who heard you will be very excited to listen to you again. So this is our guest today. We're glad to have you. Sam, would you tell us a little about yourself, who you are, what you do, and your connection to our Canadian Baptist family?
Yeah, sure. So Sam Reimer, I've been teaching sociology at Crandall University in Moncton. I've been teaching for about 30 years there.
Wow.
Most of you know that CBAC is support, or the board is supported by, Crandall University is a board supported by the denomination. And so it's been a real pleasure to be there for that many years. So I recently have joined a Baptist church. My history is being a Mennonite, but it's been a delight to be part of the family there. I'm at the Journey Church in Moncton.
Yes, I know that church well. And the connection, of course, is you teach CBAC, Canadian Baptist of Atlantic Canada. You teach at their school,
Absolutely.
At the school that's supported by them. So you do have a long partnership with us, and we're so glad for that. Thank you. But you've been doing some really interesting work. Among your other works, of course, but you recently penned a book called Caught in the Current, British and Canadian Evangelicals in an Age of Self-Spirituality. I'll confess that when we were considering having you come as a speaker, I got the book. I think I read it in like 2 sittings. I couldn't put it down.
Wow.
Not something you often say about sociology books. Maybe you do as a sociologist, but I couldn't put it down. It's such an intriguing title, Caught in the Current. Why Caught in the Current? What does that mean?
Yeah. So the idea is that the current is our Canadian culture. And a lot of people think culture is this neutral thing, that, you can just do whatever you want. You can pick the parts of culture that you like. They have this picture in their mind that it's more like a lake, where people are navigating in places in the lake, wherever their canoe takes them, and they just choose neutrally where they want to go. But what I'm arguing in the book is that culture is not like that at all. Culture is like a current in that it is pulling us, particularly religiously, all in a direction toward what I call self-spirituality or an internal locus of authority. So we don't there's no such thing as a neutral society. It always prescribes, it always scripts us toward certain things that we should do and certain things that we should not do. So the idea of being caught in the current is just to help people understand that society is very prescriptive. It is pushing you away from institutional religion and toward this kind of self-spirituality where you are your own authority.
I think that many people would say, oh, what an apt analogy. Because I think in our churches, we often do feel like we're kind of swimming against a stream.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what I hear you naming in that title, the sense that we are being pulled. And as someone who's been a pastor, who continues to be a big part of a church and works with our pastors, we hear these themes all the time. What's going on? What's going on in our world? Now, the second part of your book's title also really just felt so fitting for us. Because, of course, often as Canadians, we find that the research that we look at is kind of piggybacking off American research.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you have this great title, Caught in the Current, but you also say we're talking about British and Canadian evangelicals. So why did you choose to focus on those 2 groups, British and Canadian?
Yeah. So about, I guess it's been over 20 years now already, Leanne, I wrote a book that compared Canada and American evangelicals because there was a lot of influences from American evangelicalism that was crossing the 49th parallel into Canada. And so we were really being shaped by this much bigger and powerful and brasher version of evangelicalism south of the border. But evangelicalism in the U.S. has gone a little further away from what we are in Canada and has become a little bit more politically aligned, a little bit different than the Canadian version. And so I wanted to look at what was going on in Britain, because my sense was that Canadian evangelicalism actually looks a little bit more like British evangelicalism than it does American evangelicalism. I think that's true. I think we are, because of the direction of the U.S. evangelicalism, we're looking a little more like the Brits.
It's so great to have research that actually speaks to, no, this was found in Canada, found in, of course, as part of this Commonwealth. And you studied a group of people. I believe the number was 120?
Yeah, 120 interviews, yeah.
120 interviews. And you asked questions about what you believe. And you actually interviewed, I think this is important to name, people who were very active in their church. They were identified by their pastor as an engaged church member. So you weren't interviewing people out and about. You weren't talking to people on the street, so to speak, but people who would identify as Christian, would attend what would be considered an evangelical church, and would be active and in leadership there.
Often, yep.
And I think you found some interesting findings. And so this is where I'd love to hear about, what did you find? What do we need to understand that you discovered about what's happening in our churches?
Yeah. So what I found was the pull of the culture was really shaping people in the pews. So what I argue in the book is that we used to be people of an external authority. That is, the major institutions in society, politics, teachers, parents, pastors, all shaped what we believed, and we largely accepted their positions as things that we should accept in our hearts, right? We believed them. But what's happened over the last, at least since the 1960s, is that society has moved toward an internal locus of authority. That is, society is encouraging people to be their own authority. I know what is right. I know what is true because my intuition says so. I sense it inside of me that this is what is actually true. So this is changing the way, the culture around us, and changing the kind of people that are in the pew in evangelical churches, as well as those that are not unchurched, that are coming into our churches, because they don't operate with deference toward what the pastor says. They're operating with a sense that, hey, maybe this will help me understand what I believe a little more, but it's really up to me what I believe.
I was speaking with you earlier, and as I heard you speak to our pastors earlier today, I found myself remembering an incident of speaking to a friend of a friend, and they made this statement, I've just started going to this new church. So far I like it, but I'm going to see if it lines up with what I believe.
Exactly.
And I was so struck by that statement, because I found myself thinking, but isn't truth or religion or a God that we would want to follow, isn't that supposed to be shaping us? Shouldn't that be shaping what we think? But yet there was this idea that, well, I'll keep going if it lines up with what I've decided internally is true. And that what's interesting is this was from a churchgoer. This wasn't someone, we often think, well, this is maybe outside, but actually we're seeing this in churches. Can you say more about this external versus internal idea of authority? So when I hear it, I understand that to mean, there was a season, of course, everyone's different every generation, but that collectively, what the government said, we believe. What our teachers tell us, we believe. What our pastors tell us, that's what we think. What our church says is true. And we have shifted to this idea of, well, I'll find out what's true for me. How can we flush that out some more?
Yeah. So, you got to think back to a time when people were doing the world wars. During the time of the world wars, sort of the earlier than the boomers, the silent generation, they had a lot of deference toward authority. Society was really pushing people to do what they were told based on these major authorities in society. So this all changes, though, when we get to the 1960s, when a lot of people are rebelling and questioning the authority around them. The whole hippie movement is pushing people away from just accepting what the authorities say. And this transition was largely around the time of the boomers, when they were young. And as a result, Watergate, Vietnam, scandals with religious leaders, all these things were pushing people away from just accepting what authority said. And so this is a major shift then toward finding where, so the question is, how then do I find authority? And the answer is, well, if I can't trust these societal authorities, what I'll have to do is I'll have to find my own authority, and I'll have to kind of sift through the kinds of influences I'm getting from society around me and decide for myself which is right. So I'm based on what I sense inside. What my heart says is true is what's true for me.
It's so true. I find myself thinking back to a statement. Maybe you grew up with this one a bit, which was, the Bible says it, I believe it, that's enough for me.
Yeah.
What I hear you saying is that statement doesn't make sense to a whole lot of people. I even think in my early years when I would be doing like local missions work, and, we'd go and even knock on people's doors and we'd show them Bible verses to point things out. But now I realize people would say, I don't care what the Bible says.
Right.
It doesn't matter what the Bible tells me. I don't think that thing is true. Is that part of what you're speaking to here?
Yeah, exactly. So people will won't accept carte blanche, any authority, right? Because what I have to do is I have to find out for myself, because once we got into postmodernity, the postmodern thing, all sort of authority was questioned, right? How do I know what is really true? And so in the void of no external authorities, or all external authorities are being questioned, what naturally comes in is an internal authority. I have to find what I believe somewhere. And now I am on a quest, on a personal journey to find truth and finding fulfillment. So everybody is kind of, in general, we are moving toward that in our society, this inner authority.
And in our churches as well.
Yeah.
And so I find myself thinking, as our pastors or our church leaders are listening, or even grandparents or parents or what have you, and you think about this kind of dichotomy sometimes here, perhaps if you're leading a church with a lot of people of a boomer generation or older, and sometimes I hear the statement, well, people just need to go to church.
Yeah.
Tell the people to go to church, tell them to show up, this is truth, tell them to accept it. And they're a bit baffled. And so sometimes those, you get this tension in our churches. A lot of times our leaders are of that generation. What do they need to understand about the people that they're hoping to connect to, who are often their own children and grandchildren? What do they need to understand about what's different there and why those old strategies might not work?
Exactly. So most pastors, and especially older pastors, still operate with an external locus of authority, right? The Bible is my authority. My denominational leaders have authority in my life. And so they operate with this very clear sense that what I believe is in line with doctrinal orthodoxy that I've accepted for a long time. But what's moved now is that the tradition does not necessarily speak into people's lives and let them know what they should believe. They have to come up with their own belief. So boomers saw this in the 60s. They saw the move away from external authority, where people began to question it, but it became even stronger in future generations. That was kind of the transition time, right? The boomers. And then as we got into the Gen X and we got into the Zs, the Gen Zs, and the millennials, it became much more the direction of society. It became entrenched. And so society was moving in this direction of being of owning an internal locus of authority. So what pastors need to get is that just because they show that it's in the Bible doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to buy it, because they have to understand that people are operating based on whether or not what the pastor says is resonating with them. And whether or not it resonates with them partly depends on whether or not they find the pastor to be authentic. Is this a real person who has really found themselves and is really speaking from a non-hypocritical, they live what they believe, right? This sort of non-hypocritical place, and they really care about me. So that warmth of the relationship is really important to what I believe.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because when I hear that, I just find myself thinking of how baffling that can be for some people to, and especially for our pastors. And if they've pastored a long time, the shift they've seen in pastoring, where there was a time where the pastoral would have been very respected, where people would have sought the pastor out, what you're saying, you're a pastor, so I take it very seriously. What I'm hearing you say is the pastor almost has to earn that place to even speak into it.
Right.
And they may take or leave what you have to say.
Right.
Which has, I think, been hard to live through. I think all of us feel that tension as pastors.
Yeah. And people pick and choose what they want to believe from what you say. And yes, conversions are not necessarily based on authority or even, that you have a logically sound presentation. What they are thinking about is this a real person? Am I going to allow this person to help guide me on my personal journey, at least for a time? And is what they say resonating with what I feel inside? And so sometimes we say things that people don't particularly like, that doesn't resonate with them. It might be exclusive beliefs. It might be conservative moral positions. And because some of their other warm relationships would disagree, they're finding some dissonance there, and they won't accept what the pastor's saying.
Now, this is so interesting to me because, Sam, what would you say about this? Because I think sometimes we could hear that. And sometimes I feel pastors do this, and I love you all listening, pastors, but sometimes this can I can go, oh, that I'm not sure that's so helpful. And pastors can then go, well, they just don't care about the truth, and I'm just going to keep preaching the truth, and, it's the culture's fault. And how do we find that balance between saying, well, we're not saying to pastors that the task is then to compromise, but it should help you think about perhaps your approach.
Yes.
What could that balance look like? And to be fair, I didn't warn you about this question, but I'm very confident in your ability to answer it well.
So, because beliefs are so powerfully shaped by relationships, it's really important for pastors to understand that building relationship with them or with other authentic adults in their congregation is really important. So people will come to believe sometimes after they already belong, right? After they already have strong connections with other people. And so that's part of the pastor's role, is to really sort of build those warm relationships, or to offer opportunities where people can find that kind of warm,
that's great,
positive relationships with other people. Yeah.
I love that practical response, because we're not telling people stop preaching, the Bible, stop sharing God's word, but you're saying, it's got to be grounded in relationships as well in this generation. They're not just going to show up and you walk from the back and preach and go and sit back down, and here we are. People want to have a sense of connection.
Yeah.
You stated in your book, I made a note of a couple of things you said. You said belonging will do more than apologetics to change beliefs. And then you explore if that's true or not.
Yeah.
You mentioned someone in the book had said that. So say more about the statement. Belonging will do more than apologetics to change belief.
Right. So as I've kind of argued in some of our presentations, Leanne, beliefs is less about intellectual commitment or intellectual convincing. It's more about I believe because people who care about me, who are real, authentic people, believe this. And so we flag our position with the people, with our people, right? By what we believe. And it says something about who I am and my identity as well. So it's becoming increasingly true, I think, for a lot of young people, that they believe not because they're intellectually convinced as an apologetic model, but they believe because the people that they care about and who love them and care about them and are with them through the hard times believe that thing. And so belief becomes increasingly relational for these people.
And, I think that's good news.
A lot of ways it is.
I think there's good news in it, shall I say, because, the pastors I know are very good at relationships. And I think it's good to remind us that that's part of our ministry.
Exactly.
And that we can see that as part of what we're doing, with the hope that it will allow us to share our hope and what Christ can do for us. You also make another statement. You talk about something called a nonvert. I love that term because you know what? When I read it, I was like, I know a whole lot of nonverts. So can you tell me what a nonvert is and what we should be thinking about as we think of that idea in our churches?
Yeah. So it's not my term. It's Steve Bellevant's term, who's a UK sociologist. And he wrote a book by that name. But the idea is that a lot of people who are changing their religious identity are moving from being Christian to being none. nothing at all. That is, they have no religious affiliation. No, so
which is the fastest growing religion in Canada.
Yeah. So the nuns, the people with no religious affiliation, is the fastest growing group, and we're over a third of Canadians. Some polls even suggest a half of Canadians who have no religious belief at all. And so what we find when we look at change is that most Christians who are leaving the church are not becoming something else religious. They are either becoming spiritual and not religious, or else they're becoming none. And so we're losing, I would say, a lot of the cultural supports that used to prop up the numbers of people who would call themselves Christians just because it was culturally normal to be Christian. Right?
Yes.
Now a lot of those things are gone. And so people are saying, yeah, I haven't been to church for ages. I'm really a nun.
Yeah. And I think why I think the term nonvert speaks to me is the people in my life that I know that are nonverts, they see it like a conversion, like the time that, when I would talk about when I found Jesus, they talk about finding life outside the church as a freedom, as like I discovered, freedom outside the church, which is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But yet we're seeing that pattern more and more. But when we think of how we then share our faith, you also shared in the book that the most significant predictor of faith transmission is often parents over pastors.
Yeah.
So this is taking a little bit of a shift here because you're talking to pastors, talking to leaders. This should shape us as pastors if we realize the parents are where so much of this work's happening. How should that impact our ministry for those of us in ministry leadership?
Yeah.
And as parents, sometimes doubling.
Yeah, the weight's on the parent. So it's not that pastors or other in-church adults, grandparents, youth pastors don't matter.
Of course.
But they do matter. But what matters the most, clearly in all the research that I've seen, is the influence of the parents. Are they demonstrating to their kids not only regular church attendance, that is both parents in the same pew is really key on consistently during every Sunday. But what also matters is, are they talking about faith at home? Are they encouraging their kids to ask questions openly about their faith? Are they demonstrating devotional practices at home, like prayer and Bible study, that the kids can actually see that what they say is not just a Sunday morning thing, which looks terribly unauthentic if it was, right? So,
and this generation really values authenticity.
They definitely
They don't want you to be putting, your faith shouldn't just be a show.
That's right. So what churches need to do is they need to think about, how do we disciple parents so that they can disciple their kids? How do we help parents be the key influencer in our kids' religiosity? Because a lot of parents say, well, I'm going to take my kid to church and then we'll let the professionals take care of their spirituality, and forget that that is not going to do it. You can't disciple a kid in an hour a week, right? That has to be something that regularly happens, that they can visibly see at home. So churches need to find spaces where parents can do the kind of discipleship growing practices that will allow them to be confident enough so that they can shape their kids' spirituality and, more importantly, demonstrate the kind of spirituality that they want their kids to emulate.
And this is where I really got to do a shout out to our Children and Family Ministries department.
Absolutely.
Led by Tanya Yoon, who has incredible resources on this, wonderful faith at home practices, has these little habits you can use around the dinner table, really practical things that parents can be using, but pastors, you can be telling your parents about. We need our pastors showing these things and sharing these things. And we had a podcast on that in our last season. So we'll make sure to put a link to that in the show notes with some of those. But you have the research to back this up.
Yeah.
That, billing the parents is what we need to do. So I'm hearing you say this era of, we're going to wait for them to show up at church, and then we're going to give them the sermon. We're going to say, this is what the Bible says, and people are going to go, oh, I see it now. You're going to walk me through. You're going to do the Romans road. You're going to do the ABCs, and then I'm going to go, I realize I'm a sinner and I've been saved by grace, and here I go. That this era is not resonating with that, is not finding that to resonate in a way that it may have in generations past.
Yeah.
And even this era of saying, we'll wait till they have kids and then they'll bring their kids back to church and then we can catch up. These are things we all hear. What are we going to say to those messages when we hear that? How do we need to shift in light of that?
Yeah. So it's largely true that even when kids are young and they want to teach the kids good values, there's not a lot of returning to church. There's a lot of people who just aren't doing church, and especially after COVID, a lot of them have switched off of doing that. So regular church attendance is definitely going downhill.
May I comment on that before you continue? You shared today, actually, a stat that is very sobering. You shared that 50% of people, about 50%, actually describe religion as a negative thing.
Yeah, it's true.
So not positive and not neutral, but they're actually saying this is harmful.
Yeah.
So that's very sobering.
Yeah, it is.
So this isn't the era where people go, I'm going to send my kids to VBS because that's okay and it's a free week at camp.
Yeah.
They don't want to send their kids to church. That could be a bad place.
Right.
And so please continue. They're not necessarily bringing their kids back, especially if they think it's a negative place.
Exactly. So there's been a lot of a lot of stuff in the news recently about, moral failures of religious leaders, the way, residential schools were handled by religious leaders. So there's a lot of bad press out there for religious leaders. So people aren't necessarily viewing religion in a neutral way, as you're suggesting. So that's another hurdle, right?
Yes.
For pastors to try to get over. But I think what's important for pastors to understand in our era is that people are, the cultural default setting is internal authority. That is, I need to find my own way. And it's important for young people, particularly, to understand that they are actually not creators of their own destiny. They are not actually operating in this kind of lake idea where everybody can go wherever they want and find out who they are freely, because everybody is being influenced by society. Everybody is being shaped by the warm relationships around them that have influenced them, and the cold ones too. Everybody is being influenced by their time on the internet, where the algorithms are deciding what the authorities are. A lot of people are being shaped by the influences of social media. So all these things are shaping people. Society is shaping you in ways that you do not understand. And so then the question is, what is your authority? Is your authority that is shaping your life computer algorithms? Is it your own ideas of what you believe? And are those good authorities? Is the way I feel really a stable place to build a self on? And I would say the answer is probably no. And churches can offer people a benevolent, stable, loving authority, we call God, that made humans and already knows how humans function best. And so we think that God is the one who can be the kind of authority that's really going to help you find your way in life, unlike social media or whatever else.
That's so well said. And I mean, I'm thinking it'd be so easy to hear that and go, great, I'm going to get up on Sunday. I'm going to say, social media is not your authority.
Yeah.
Stop listening to all those outside voices. God is your benevolent authority. That probably doesn't help either, because we still have to remember all these things that we're learning, that has to be done in relationship, has to be done with understanding, has to be done with authenticity. We see these struggles. We know it's hard. Here's an invitation for you. Even our language that we use is such a shift. Now, there's another distinction that you make in the book, and that's this distinction that I thought this was interesting, that as you were talking about all these things happening, you say a lot of these themes are common in the US, in Canada, and Britain. But you also spoke about Canadians and British tendencies to describe themselves as evangelicals as not like Americans.
Yeah.
And I have to admit that I laughed when I read it, and you said it seemed that the main difference between these two things is simply them just saying that they say we're not like Americans. But why is that relevant? Why is it relevant that we're describing ourselves that way?
Yeah. So in all my interviews, I never raised anything about the U.S. These people volunteered this information.
Really?
I never said anything about it.
How often would it come up?
Oh, like regularly. I would say over half the interviews talked about the U.S. thing. So the issue is that the U.S. evangelicalism is so big, so much in the news, so flashy, so brash, that everybody in the Western world thinks that they are being stereotyped based on Americans' understanding of American evangelicalism. So it's hard to escape, as I say, from under the shadow of the eagle. Everybody thinks evangelicalism means American evangelicalism. So people were constantly saying, we're not like the American evangelicals. They just wanted to make sure that people didn't think that they were, nationalistic, or that they were xenophobic, or that they hated immigrants, or whatever else, because that's the stereotype that's going on there. So that was one of the key areas that distinguished them. We heard the same sort of thing in Canada and Britain about this being the foil, this being the area that we wanted to distinguish ourselves from. We're not like American evangelicals. Instead, we're welcoming, we're open-minded, we like people who are different than us, and we want them to come to our churches.
Yeah, and so we're feeling this burden that we're going to get lumped
Exactly
with this kind of other thing, and this is another weight that we're carrying. So you're not alone if you feel that way.
Exactly.
But it sounds like the things you're saying are still where we need to start. Yeah. It's still going to be founded in authentic relationship. It's still going to be founded in that willingness to engage in authentic ways.
That's right.
There's so much we could take from this. Obviously, I would encourage anyone to go and read your book, which is sold at the Read On bookstore or in other places in your local bookstores as well. But I know Bernice would love to send it to you. You can connect to that through CBOQ. But as a final question, how can our churches or anyone listening take what you have learned in your study to help us learn to swim in this current?
Yeah. So it's important to understand that pastors need to understand that they're operating in a different wavelength. They're operating a different worldview, understanding than are a lot of people in their pews, even people who are regularly there. And the task of transmitting the faith in the way that most pastors hope will happen is something that is not quick and easy, because you're working against a powerful pull of the culture. So what we need to do as pastors, in my view, is partly to bring to the surface the parts of the culture that are taken for granted, that are hidden, that are sort of below the surface, and understand that this is really what's shaping people, and help them to understand that, you need to not just be shaped by default. You need to think carefully about the forces that shape you and decide whether or not you really want those things to have authority in your life, because they're definitely shaping you. And we can help people be shaped by the right sort of influences if they understand what is actually influencing them. So I say it's a good place to start.
It's so well said. I so appreciated your insights and wisdom today. Is there anything else that you felt would be valuable to share that you didn't get to share up to this point?
I wanted to let pastors know there's a good reason for hope, that we see the winds beginning to change, and the pull of the current maybe is becoming a little softer. So we're seeing some interest, at least, in churches from our younger generations, particularly the millennials. And this is partly because a lot of them have never been to church, and they don't have a bad attitude toward it, right? They haven't been shaped by a religious zeitgeist. And so they're willing to try it out. And there are things going on in our culture that make people want to ask big questions again, because depression, loneliness, anxiety are big in our society, and people are wanting answers to that will help them navigate through this very difficult waters. So I think that the church really has a role to play. And I think people are at least willing to consider that the church might be able to help them on their journey.
I think we're seeing that to be true. I find myself thinking of a story from a church that I'd heard of a young person who was invited by a friend to youth group and had never grown up going to church, I think baptized as a baby, and went home and called their friend that night and just was teary and said, I've never felt loved like that before. I never felt like I belonged so quickly before. And, we were chatting later, this mutual friend, and I said, I wonder when they'll be able to put the words to say, I felt God. I felt God. But the starting place was that belonging, that welcome. And that person did go on to become a Christian, was recently baptized.
Nice.
And so we do see that there's hope in the church. I still believe the church is a place for hope and where people can best go to meet God. And I pray our churches can be that.
Amen.
Thank you for the work that you do to help our churches. And thank you for being here today, Dr. Reimer.
My pleasure.
Bless you.